Hello beautiful people and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be working on this very old cupboard that someone built for their workshop. What seemed to be a pretty easy and straightforward project turned out to be the most challenging thing I've done so far on this channel. This was built for someone's workshop and as far as I know it was in there for about 60 years. As you can see, this is incredibly poor quality and it's just not something that you would want to have in your house. This was absolutely disgusting and rotten. Everything was just full of woodworm damage, dust, and I just didn't really want to touch it with my bare hands. I vacuumed it because there were spider webs everywhere and it was super dusty, and I took this bit off because I don't even know what this was for, but I didn't want it, and the back was completely rotten, so I just took it off. I guess there is no going back now. I tried to remove as many nails as I could, but they would just break off. That's how rusted they were. And I also removed the trim because I wanted to replace it with something else and kind of keep the same design. But I had to adjust my plans and actually change them completely. Unfortunately, this was covered in lead paint and there were about 7 layers of paint. I couldn't actually count all of them, that's how many there were. And you'll actually see in a minute, but because so many of you have asked me about what you do with lead paint, I decided to take on this project and show you how I would do it. By no means I recommend working with lead paint. This can be very dangerous if you inhale the dust, so you need to have proper PPE and you need to know what the risk is. And the reality is that, as far as furniture, you don't need to work on something that's got lead paint on it. But if you have an old house and you want to restore it, you don't really have a choice. So I will show you what I did, and maybe if you ever have to work with something like this, you'll know what to do as well. I had to spray everything with woodworm treatment spray because it was just completely rotten, and I did it outside because I didn't want any of the dust in my workshop. I used 40 grit sandpaper just to make sure the dust particles were not super fine, if it makes sense. And after I was done with everything, I replaced both bags, the one in my vacuum and the one in the dust extractor. When I was happy with how much paint I removed, I went to B&Q, which is like Home Depot in the UK, to get some supplies. Because I wasn't planning on dealing with lead paint, I didn't really want to have it exposed or even sealed, so I decided to build some sort of sarcophagus and just enclose this whole thing inside and build a new piece of furniture around it. This cupboard was literally just a piece of trash. Like, I can't really tell you how bad it was. Everything was rotten, so I decided to soak the whole cupboard in wood hardener. This probably sounds silly, but I just felt bad for this cupboard because it just looked horrible and it spent its entire life in the workshop gathering dust. So I decided to not only give it a new life, but make it super glamorous and turn it into something it's never been. As I mentioned, when I was done with sanding, I changed the bag in my dust extractor and in the vacuum as well, and just did everything I possibly could to avoid having contact with the dust. That includes taking my clothes off and dusting them off, as well as washing them. What I'm doing here is just filling in this gap because I think there was some sort of lock and I wanted to glue a piece of plywood on top of it, so I just didn't want any gaps. I think it's pretty self-explanatory what I'm doing here, but I'm basically covering this entire cupboard with thin pieces of wood, and I made a new back as well. The veneered plywood that I bought was pretty low quality, so I'm going to veneer the whole thing, but I'm just enclosing the cupboard for now. The door was so rotten that it wasn't even feasible to repair it in any way, so I decided to cut off that piece where hinges were attached to and just replace it with an offcut of oak board that I had just to make it stronger. And because it was going to be covered with plywood and veneer, I used screws and glue to attach this piece. My original plan was to keep the design similar, cover everything with plywood and veneer, and then cut out those recessed bits, but that changed. The pieces that I'm cutting now, they're meant to be shelf supports, but as you'll see in a minute, that changed as well. When you work with something as bad as this, you need to be flexible because the plan you might have at the beginning doesn't always work. I made a spacer out of a piece of board just to make sure those shelves would be at the same level. As I was screwing in the shelf support bits, the shop inspector stopped by to check on the progress. I gave him a snack and back to work. As you can see, the top and the bottom were not flat at all, not even close, so I used my planer just to kind of even out the surface so I could attach a piece of plywood to it. I didn't have a piece of plywood large enough to cover the entire back, but you won't be able to see the joint because I will cover it later. Everything was really crooked, so it was a challenge to cut those pieces of plywood, but I got there in the end. As I said, I used veneer to cover this plywood because it was low quality, and I also used some tape to prevent contact adhesive from getting on the surface. This is the first time I'm using this particular contact adhesive, and this is more liquidy, so you can actually apply it with a brush. And I liked it. It was very easy to work with. Obviously it stinks like hell, so you need to wear a respirator mask, but it worked very well and it was cheap. I used some pieces of wood to prevent the veneer from sticking until I was ready for it to stick. If you've never worked with contact adhesive, it's super easy. You just wait about 10 minutes until it's dry to the touch, and then you press both surfaces together. You can do it with a roller or with a tool like what I'm using. I just made this one myself. But you can use something as simple as a piece of board. Just make sure the edge is smooth so you don't scratch the veneer. That's how easy it is. This obviously took a long time, and I'm not gonna make you watch this entire process, but you've got an idea. As always, I wanted to say a huge thank you to every single person who comments, likes and watches my videos. I really appreciate it, and huge thank you to channel members. You guys are amazing. And for everyone who would like to support what I do, you can visit the links in the description and you can buy me a coffee or hit the super thanks button, or visit my Amazon wishlist link. Thank you. We've had pretty bad weather recently in the UK and the power went off for some reason, but fortunately I have one of those power banks, so I managed to keep the lights on and continue working. And before you ask, for most of this video I'll have some sort of mask on, even though this cupboard is pretty much enclosed at this point. But until I do a proper deep clean of my workshop, I just want to protect myself. I used edge bending for those narrow pieces and it wasn't wide enough, so I had to combine two of them, but it actually worked quite well. For those of you who've never used this before, it's got glue on the back and you just iron it on. It melts the glue and that's it. It just sticks to the surface that you put it on. At this point, I'm still thinking that I'm going to reuse the door, so I'm just applying some veneer, but as I mentioned, I wanted this cupboard to look glamorous and just give it a completely new purpose, a new life, and make it look different, so I actually abandoned this idea, so I did not use the door in the end. So here's my new plan. I'm adding some extra bits to what used to be support for the shelves, and they're going to support a board on the bottom of this cupboard because I'm going to use it in a horizontal position. I'm cutting some test sliding doors just to make sure they work. This plywood is actually way too thick, but I just want to make sure it looks nice and it fits. And this is going to be one of the new supports for the shelf that I'm going to make. I used a piece of board as a spacer to make sure that the support was on the same height on both sides. The piece of plywood that I'm using is not thick enough, so I'm just making one shelf to make sure it fits, and then I'm gonna make another one just like this and glue both of them together. I clumped it together and I let it dry. I got these C-channel brass thingies and I wanted to use them as channels or rails for my sliding doors. As you can see, the sides or the ends of the cupboard were open, so I had to come up with an idea to stop the doors. So I used pieces of wood to stop the doors and pieces of trim to go over them, just to make them look nice and match the rest of the aesthetic. I made it so the oak trim piece is wider than the wood underneath, so you can't really see it. And to attach it, I use regular wood glue and also super glue and activator to hold it in place until the wood glue dries. When the shelf was dry, I covered the edge of the plywood with a piece of edge banding. And I also cut a piece of plywood with much nicer veneer for the bottom of this new cupboard. I cleaned up those C-channel brass thingies and gave them a nice brushed finish. And I used this nice quality plywood with oak veneer for the doors. The plywood that I was using did not fit in those channels, so I had to cut rebates or rabbets depending on where you live, and I use my table saw to do that. I need to do a bit more sanding and a little bit of wood filler, but this is basically what it's gonna look like other than the base, and the brass rails are not attached yet. Because I'm extra, I cut pieces of trim to cover all the corners on the inside of the cupboard. If you remember from the beginning of this video, I bought this oak board, which was super expensive. It's not long enough for this entire base, so I'm cutting it in half. But I'm afraid that it's not gonna be wide enough to give me enough support for the legs, but I do have a solution for that. I'm going to use pocket holes and screws for the base and to make it easy to detach it in case I decide to make something different. I'm also pre-drilling holes to attach the base to the bottom of the cupboard. And this is what I'm going to use for the legs. So this is what I was talking about. The legs are quite long and they're not going to have enough support, and I don't want them to break, so I do have a solution and you'll see in a minute what I did. I also used a piece of oak veneer to cut out my logo and glue it on the inside. And as I mentioned before, I made a little brace thingy to cover the join of those two pieces of plywood on the back. And this is my solution for the legs. I basically made a little jig thingy just to enable me to drill holes straight through the legs, and I use dowels to connect them and make the whole base more rigid. And because I only had one dowel, I used this thingy for making dowels to make more. You basically use a piece of wood that's slightly bigger than the dowel you want to make, and it doesn't matter what shape it is, as long as the tip is round so you can put it in, and that's it. And when I was done with that, it was finally the time to put some color on this. Because I'm actually gonna use this as a TV stand, I'm spraying walnut stain on it just to match the rest of the furniture in my lounge, and also because I like the color and to kind of blend all the shades of wood together, because as you can see there's some plywood on the inside and veneer on the outside, so this way everything is gonna look the same color. When the stain was dry, I used Osmo hard wax oil as a finish, and it gave me a nice, quite matte look, which I was pretty happy with. And I'm almost finished. I'm so glad I was actually able to complete this project. It was such a challenge dealing with lead and wearing PPE the whole time, and just figuring out what to do with it. But I'm so glad that I was actually able to give this old rotten cupboard a new life and a chance to experience the sort of life it's never had and actually being in someone's house. So if you guys enjoyed it, give it a like and comment, and if you're feeling generous, you can buy me a coffee or hit the super thanks button. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.